Ladies and gentlemen, there is a temptation when wronged by others to hold tightly to our wounds, to let them fester and darken, giving in to anger and seeking justice as if the scales of the world were ours to balance. It is all too easy to forget that we are not alone in this. There is a higher hand at work, a divine wisdom that moves unseen, shaping not only our lives, but also the lives of those who have wronged us. And in the midst of our suffering, we must trust that God is working, not just in us, but also in the hearts of those who have hurt us. First, we must recognize that God's justice does not always operate on the same timetable as ours. We live in a world of immediacy, but God's ways transcend our human understanding of time. Justice may not come swiftly, but in the quiet unfolding of the seasons, God is at work, bringing justice when it is most needed. Trust that He does not forget, and though His actions may be slow, they are perfect. His justice is never hasty nor misplaced. This brings us to our second sign, the growth of forgiveness. You see, forgiveness is not the simple act of excusing the wrongs done against you. It is a surrender that allows God to heal your heart. He may bring you to a place where, though the pain remains, your anger toward the one who hurt you will begin to fade. That peace you feel is God, not just healing your heart, but beginning to work in the heart of the person who harmed you. Now we may ask, why does this pain exist at all? Here's the third sign. God uses our wounds, our hurt, and our suffering for a greater purpose. It is easy to see pain as something entirely negative, yet in God's hands it becomes something that shapes us, molds us into someone stronger and more compassionate. Your suffering might be part of a grand plan, where through your pain you grow closer to the divine and your ability to empathize with others deepens. What seems unjust may, in time, reveal itself to be part of a divine story we cannot yet see. But of course, what happens when we begin to release that hurt? When we let go of the desire for vengeance and place our trust in God's timing, the fourth sign begins to appear, a growing inner peace. This peace doesn't come from forgetting what has happened, but from knowing that God is doing His work not just in you, but in the person who harmed you. There may be a time when, despite the pain, you find yourself no longer yearning for retribution, but instead resting in the assurance that God is handling things in a way that transcends your understanding. And with that peace comes the fifth sign, conviction. You may start to notice that the person who wronged you begins to feel the weight of their actions. It may come in small moments, through guilt or remorse they cannot easily shake. You may not see the change immediately, but deep within, God is working in them, convicting their hearts. The slow and steady transformation of their soul is a testament to the quiet but powerful influence of God. But this isn't where it ends. No, God's work is far from finished. As He works in both your heart and the heart of the one who hurt you, a strange thing begins to happen. You find yourself feeling empathy for their brokenness, their hurt, their weaknesses, their flaws. All of these things, which once felt like the cause of your own pain, suddenly begin to stir compassion in you. You see them not as the sum of their offenses, but as a fellow traveler in a world filled with brokenness, in desperate need of God's grace. Finally, there comes the possibility of restoration. Sometimes, in the midst of this divine work, relationships are not only healed, but transformed. You may find that the person who hurt you is no longer the person they once were. Through God's work, a bond once shattered can be pieced together, not returning to what it was, but rising again as something different, stronger, and filled with grace. And so, my friends, if you find yourself hurt, remember this: God is not absent. His hand is at work even in those who have caused you pain. Trust that He is healing you, working on them, and in time will reveal a deeper peace and a higher justice than we could ever achieve on our own. God is always present in our wounds, always seeking to restore, redeem, and bring new life. When we experience harm at the hands of others, one of the most common responses is to demand immediate justice. It is natural to want to see the wrongdoer held accountable, particularly when the pain is fresh. However, the nature of divine justice is profoundly different from human expectations. While human justice often operates within the confines of time and circumstance, God's justice operates beyond these boundaries. It's not dictated by our sense of urgency or the immediate need for retribution. God's justice is not always immediate because He is not simply concerned with punishing the wrongdoer in a moment of anger or retribution. Instead, His justice is rooted in a much deeper wisdom, one that takes into account the entirety of a person's life, their growth, their motivations, and even their future redemption. God's justice is always perfect, not hasty or driven by the emotional reaction that so often governs our sense of fairness. While we might desire quick punishment for those who hurt us, God's justice has a far-reaching purpose that goes beyond what we can immediately perceive. The Scriptures tell us that God's ways are not our ways, Isaiah 55:8. Our limited view of justice often overlooks the full scope of divine mercy, patience, and long-term healing. We want to see someone pay for their wrongs right away, but God in His infinite wisdom knows that true transformation comes not from quick punishment, but from the slow work of inner conviction. This process might take years, and it may unfold in ways we don't recognize immediately. However, it is this very process that allows for true healing and restoration, both for the victim and the wrongdoer. Understanding that God's justice is not bound by time means that we must learn to trust His timing. We may not understand why things unfold the way they do, or why it seems that the wrongdoer is never held accountable, but God's justice will come in His perfect timing. It may not look like what we expect, but it will be just, and it will bring about healing and restoration in ways we cannot yet imagine. This understanding helps us release our grip on vengeance and trust that, in the end, God will set all things right, even if it takes longer than we would like. Forgiveness is often misunderstood. It is not the mere act of releasing someone from the debt they owe you, nor is it a passive acceptance of the wrong done. True forgiveness is a profound spiritual transformation that goes far deeper than our surface emotions. It is a painful but necessary journey, a journey that requires us to trust in God's healing power, even when it seems impossible to let go of the pain. The process of forgiveness is not an easy one. It is not simply a matter of deciding to forgive in an instant, especially when the hurt is deep and the wounds are fresh. Forgiveness takes time, and in this time God works in us. Often the initial steps toward forgiveness are marked by a sense of anger, confusion, or betrayal. It is common to wrestle with the question of whether forgiveness means excusing the behavior of the one who hurt us. However, forgiveness does not mean we erase the wrong done to us or that we ignore the pain. Rather, it is a decision to trust God with the situation and to release the need for vengeance. The painful aspect of forgiveness is that it forces us to confront our own wounds. Forgiveness doesn't simply allow us to move on from the offense. It compels us to face the hurt head-on and to surrender it to God. This is often where the difficulty lies, because to truly forgive, we must allow God to change our hearts. It is an act of surrendering our right to hold on to the pain, our desire for retribution, and our inclination to define the other person by their wrongdoing. Through this process, God works in us. Forgiveness often leads to inner peace, not because the wrong has been justified, but because we have trusted God to deal with it in a way we cannot. The healing that comes with forgiveness may not be immediate, but over time we find that God is transforming us into people who are more like Him, people who are capable of extending grace even when it is difficult. The growth of forgiveness, while painful, is also deeply transformative. It makes us more aligned with the heart of God, who forgives us our own sins despite our unworthiness. Suffering and pain are inevitable parts of the human experience. However, it is easy to see pain as meaningless or as something to be avoided at all costs. In the midst of deep hurt, it can be incredibly difficult to understand why God would allow such suffering. Yet the truth of Scripture is that God does not waste our pain. Rather, He uses it to fulfill His greater purposes. This is one of the most profound mysteries of the Christian faith, the idea that God's redemptive power can take our most broken and painful moments and turn them into something good. God's purposes are far beyond what we can comprehend in our limited understanding. When we experience pain, especially at the hands of others, it is tempting to think that it serves no higher purpose. However, God is never inactive in our suffering. While we may not see it in the moment, He is working to shape us through these trials. Our pain, if surrendered to Him, becomes the raw material He uses to refine our character. It is through the most difficult of experiences that we often grow the most. Our faith becomes more solidified, our compassion deepens, and our dependence on God becomes more pronounced. God uses our pain to draw us closer to Him. When we are hurt, we often face the deepest questions of life and faith. These moments can drive us to prayer, to seeking understanding, and to pursuing God with greater urgency. It is in these moments of brokenness that we are often most receptive to God's healing. The pain itself becomes a vehicle through which God can enter into our hearts more profoundly, transforming us into vessels of His grace. Furthermore, God uses our pain to help us relate to others. When we suffer, we are more likely to empathize with others who are in pain. We learn to comfort others with the comfort we have received. In this way, our pain serves a dual purpose. Not only does it draw us closer to God, but it also allows us to be instruments of His love to others. In this way, God's plan for our pain is far greater than what we can see in the moment. Our suffering becomes a part of His larger, redemptive plan that stretches far beyond our individual lives. Amidst the storm of conflict, one of the clearest signs that God is working in our lives is the gradual appearance of inner peace. This peace doesn't come from a resolution of the external circumstances, nor does it come from the absence of pain. Instead, it is a deep sense of trust in God, a peace that transcends our understanding and defies our circumstances. When we experience peace in the midst of conflict, it is a clear sign that God is at work, transforming our hearts and our perspective. This inner peace is not a temporary feeling or a fleeting emotional state. Rather, it is a profound peace that comes from knowing that God is in control, even when things seem chaotic. It is a peace that rests in the assurance that God is faithful, that He is with us in the midst of our pain, and that He is working out His purposes even when we cannot see them. The presence of peace is a sign that we are no longer relying on our own efforts to resolve the conflict or control the situation. When we are at peace, we are letting go of our need to fix everything and instead surrendering the situation to God. This peace comes when we recognize that while we may not understand why things are happening the way they are, we trust that God's wisdom is greater than ours and that His plans are good. Interestingly, this peace doesn't always mean that the situation will immediately change. In fact, it may continue to be painful, difficult, or unresolved. However, God's peace allows us to live in the midst of these challenges without being overwhelmed by them. It gives us the strength to endure, to persevere, and to remain faithful even in the most difficult of circumstances. The presence of peace, then, is a profound indicator that God is working in us and that He is teaching us to trust Him more deeply. It is a sign that we are no longer bound by our own desires for justice or control, but are resting in God's sovereignty and love. One of the most remarkable signs that God is dealing with the person who has hurt you is the quiet internal conviction that begins to stir in their heart. While it may not be immediately visible, God works in the hearts of individuals in ways that we cannot always perceive. The person who has wronged you may begin to feel the weight of their actions, often without you having to say a word. This is not something that can be forced or manipulated, but a subtle, divine conviction that leads them to recognize their wrongdoing. This conviction is part of the broader redemptive process that God works in the lives of all people. Even those who hurt us are not beyond his reach. He loves them just as much as he loves us, and his desire is to bring them to a place of repentance and transformation. This process may take time, and it may look different for each individual. For some, the conviction might be sudden and overwhelming, while for others it may come more slowly, like a seed planted in their heart. The convicting work of God in the offender's heart is significant for several reasons. First, it reminds us that we are not the ones responsible for bringing justice to the situation. God is at work in ways that we cannot see, and we can trust that he will deal with the wrongdoer in the most effective and redemptive way. Second, it helps us let go of our desire for vengeance or retribution. We no longer have to be the ones to make things right. Instead, we can rest in the assurance that God is at work in both our lives and the lives of those who have hurt us. The conviction of the heart is often the first step toward healing for the wrongdoer. It is the beginning of their own transformation. Though it may not immediately manifest in visible repentance or change, God is at work, and we can trust that he is leading them toward a place of restoration. As God deals with both our hearts and the hearts of those who have hurt us, one of the surprising results is the development of a deeper sense of empathy. Over time, we may begin to see the person who hurt us not just as the sum of their actions, but as someone who is also wounded, broken, and in need of grace. This shift in perspective does not excuse their behavior, but it allows us to see them through God's eyes, as a fellow human being who is struggling with their own inner turmoil. Empathy is a powerful tool for healing both for the victim and the wrongdoer. It allows us to recognize the pain and brokenness in others, which can soften our hearts and remove the desire for judgment. When we begin to empathize with the person who has hurt us, we are no longer viewing them solely through the lens of their offense. Instead, we begin to see them as a person who, like us, is in need of healing, redemption, and God's grace. This does not mean that we ignore or minimize the harm done to us. Rather, it means that we understand that the wrongdoer's actions are often the result of their own pain, fear, or brokenness. Just as we need God's mercy, they too need it. This understanding enables us to approach the situation with a spirit of compassion rather than condemnation. Through empathy, we also recognize that the work God is doing in us is not just for our own healing, but also for the healing of the person who hurt us. God's grace extends to both parties, and as we learn to empathize with the struggles of others, we grow in our capacity to forgive and to love them as Christ does. One of the most beautiful outcomes of God working in the lives of those who have hurt us is the potential for restoration. This does not mean that every relationship will return to what it once was, but it does mean that God has the power to bring healing and reconciliation where there was once division and pain. Through God's work, broken relationships can be mended, not necessarily to restore the old pattern of the relationship, but to create a new and stronger bond grounded in understanding, grace, and shared transformation. Restoration requires humility and a willingness to forgive on both sides. It may take time, and it may involve difficult conversations and personal change. However, God's work of restoration is profound. When both parties are open to God's healing work, there is the possibility of a relationship that is stronger, more authentic, and rooted in love. In some cases, restoration may not look like a complete return to the past. It might mean learning how to relate to one another in a new way, with boundaries and respect for each other's healing journeys. It might involve a new understanding of one another's struggles and a shared commitment to walk through life together in a way that honors God and one another. Ultimately, the restoration of relationships is a sign of God's work in the world. It reflects His ability to take broken things and make them whole again, not by erasing the past, but by transforming it into something new. Even in the midst of pain, God is working to bring about reconciliation and healing, demonstrating His power to restore what was once lost. In conclusion, the journey of dealing with those who have hurt us is not easy, but it is one filled with profound spiritual transformation. The signs that God is at work in both our lives and the lives of those who have wronged us remind us that His justice, while not immediate, is always perfect and divine. As we surrender our pain to God, we experience the growth of forgiveness, an essential part of healing, and come to understand that our suffering is never without purpose in His greater plan. The peace we find in the midst of conflict is a sure sign that God is working, and the conviction that may stir in the heart of the one who hurt us signals His transformative power. Through empathy, we learn to see others with compassion, and in the process, we discover the potential for restoration in even the most broken relationships. Ultimately, God's work in us and others leads to a deeper understanding of His grace, mercy, and love. By trusting His divine process, we can find peace, healing, and, in time, restoration, both for ourselves and the ones who have caused us pain.